In today's conversation with Professor Robert E. May, Professor Emeritus of History, Purdue University, we will examine the America in which Wallingford, Connecticut native son Moses Yale Beach came of age in and influenced the Antebellum Era, from the War of 1812 to the Civil War. To provide our viewers with some context, Moses Yale Beach was born at the turn of the 19th century in January 1800 and died approximately 3 years after Lincoln was assassinated in 1868. While Professor May will help us understand this antebellum period of history, we know that our collective understanding continues to be transformed. Many recent works have contributed new insights into the years 1846 to 1848, the middle of Mr. Beach's editorial control of the penny paper The Sun. Recent books like The Dead March, A History of the Mexican-American War by Peter Gardino, and South to Freedom, Runaway Slaves to Mexico, and The Road to the Civil War by Alice Baumgarten, and The War Before the War, Fugitive Slaves and the Struggle for America's Soul by Andrew Del Banco, have newly influenced the teaching of this period by adding the voices of the slaves and the people of Mexico, a Mexico that included Texas and California.
Moses Yale Beach personifies that spirit in so many different ways. I mean, we have a man who tries many different ventures. We shouldn't just think of him as the editor of The Sun. We need to think of him as a man who tried cabinet making, who was involved in an unsuccessful paper mill project. He was important in the newspaper world, and we've talked a lot about his innovations, like his involvement in the forming of the Associated Press, his leadership in that, and his role in the Pony Express during the Mexican War in the East. We all think of the Pony Express as something that took the mail to California, but there were other Pony Expresses. So he was very innovative in his newspaper work, and we've talked about his use of carrier pigeons and the like. He also was involved in banking and was a director of 4 different banks at one point. He had an interest in cross-Isthmian transportation in Central America in the time before the Panama Canal, getting news, mail, getting baggage, and goods across Central America or Mexico. And then that played out after the Mexican War. Now, he played such an important role during the Mexican War. And then all of a sudden, because of the Mexican War, we gained permanent ownership of California. And then they immediately find gold there. And all of a sudden, people are rushing there to get rich off the gold. And smart entrepreneurs say, well, we can get rich off the people going to California to get rich off the gold. And we can do it by selling goods and other things. So he actually fits out a packet ship out to California. They rent out the ship as a storehouse and so on and so forth. He's definitely reflective of his age. When he sees opportunities, he seizes on them. He's imaginative. He represents America. During Beach's era, the governments, both state and federal, do a heck of a lot to encourage Americans to become entrepreneurs. And what do I mean? Well, first of all, they like with Hamilton's plan, they subsidize a lot of the development of the country. So you have subsidizing the national road, which linked the East with the Midwest, building of canals, railroads, and eventually, right before his death, the Transcontinental Railroad. Government encourages people to settle new areas and develop them, and it does this by constantly reducing the price of land and the number of acres you had to buy federal land. I don't know of a single instance where the price of land went up between the founding of the country in 1789 and Beach's death. Of course, the government paid for the surveys of the land that made the settlement possible. So the government is encouraging entrepreneurs of all kinds. And then you have Supreme Court decisions like Gibbons versus Ogden, which really ruled out monopolies or discouraged them, that limited the powers of state charters. So if a state chartered a corporation, it didn't prohibit other corporations from similar development programs. State banking laws, which opened up free banking across the country. Earlier on, you had to get an individual charter and you had to pass all sorts of requirements for states to charter banks. Later on, these requirements were generalized so that anyone qualifying for the charter was more or less automatically able to set up a bank. There were general incorporation laws, which made it possible to set up corporations in general, limited liability laws. What could encourage someone more to set up a corporation than the fact that you can't personally be sued for bankruptcy if your enterprise fails? These things encourage entrepreneurs like Moses Yale Beach to gamble. And thus, I think he's very representative of the age of entrepreneurialism.
You provide us with a very compelling portrait of this entrepreneurial spirit and how Beach embodies that to an extent, and how the time was just right for him, how the time was made for this. In some ways, you look ahead to our next question, because you mentioned John Calhoun, so that takes us to the political context. Can you comment on the politics of the period and statesmen like Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John Calhoun, and the attempt to find legislative solutions to the divisive issue of slavery?
I think it's very important to understand this if you want to understand Moses Yale Beach's life, because so many of Beach's columns, in one way or another, had to do with the problem of slavery in North America. The United States Constitution punted the slavery question. One of the most misunderstood documents in American history. All men are created equal. That was something that was written into the Declaration of Independence. And it was phrasing from Thomas Jefferson and the men who worked with him on drafting the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution said that Congress could abolish the slave trade from Africa 20 years later. There was a fugitive slave clause which supported slavery in those states that still had it. It said you had to return escaped enslaved peoples. Didn't use the word slavery. Persons held to bondage or whatever the phrase was. So the whole thing was punted down the road. The Constitution gave the South enough power in the U.S. government, power that translated into more ability to elect U.S. presidents, more ability to elect U.S. congressmen in particular, and also ultimately control the Supreme Court. That's why you get the Dred Scott decision later saying that blacks can't be U.S. citizens. The Constitution had this 3/5 clause, which said that even though African American slaves could not vote in any elections in the South, they still would count to grow the South's representation in Congress. The Constitution punted the question of slavery down the road. The Revolution, of course, had gotten the U.S. All the geography of North America below Canada and above Mexico and Florida, of course, to the Mississippi River. Of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, when Jefferson basically gets a good share of the land between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. Now we've got a real problem because the slavery question had been pretty much settled in the East by the end of the War of 1812. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 that was passed just before the Constitution kept slavery out of the area that we consider now the upper Midwest as part of kind of an implicit deal made by Yankees and Southerners earlier in our country to keep the country together. Southerners were allowed to establish slavery in areas, new areas below the Ohio River, like Kentucky and Tennessee, and eventually Mississippi and Alabama. You've got this huge area up to the Rockies now that begins to be developed. Jefferson, of course, sends out the Lewis and Clark expedition. And even before, decades up after the War of 1812, you've got a new state across the Mississippi River, Missouri, applying for admission to the Union. As far as Southerners are concerned, no deal has been struck about the area across the Mississippi River. They're U.S. citizens. They consider their enslaved workers property. They felt that they had a right to take their property into any new areas. The people in Missouri and the territory there were ready to make it a slave state. There were enough pro-slavery settlers that they sent to the U.S. Congress a prospective constitution that would have admitted Missouri as a slave state. In Congress, Northerners opposed this. They didn't feel they'd made any deal that they would allow slavery west of the Mississippi River. And there were proposals by Northerners to ban slavery in Missouri. There was talk of even civil war back then, breaking up the Union. Southerners were furious that Northerners would attack what they called their institutions, their way of life. Finally, a deal is struck by a great American politician from Kentucky, Henry Clay, who became known as the great compromiser for the compromises he would help strike between the North and the South throughout his career. They strike a deal. Yes, they'll let Missouri in as a slave state, but to balance it so that the South wouldn't get extra power in Congress to protect slavery forever, they're going to admit Maine as a free state. And then, of course, there's the question of what to do with the rest of the Louisiana Purchase. They agreed on was they would draw a line. It's known as the Missouri Compromise Line. And across the Missouri's southern boundary, all the way through the rest of the Louisiana Territory up to where U.S. possession ended. North of that line, slavery would be prohibited. South of that line, it could be established in the future. We don't acquire any major land for about 2 decades after the Missouri Compromise is struck. And so Americans turn inward. We develop a new political party system that's very sharply defined between the Democrats and the Whigs. The Whigs were a totally new party. The Democrats had an anchor in the old Democratic Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson. You have an entirely new political system, which is really, although they do occasionally have to deal with slavery-related issues, the most important things dividing Whigs and Democrats are matters of policy. There was a famous bank war between the Democrats and especially President Andrew Jackson, who got rid of the second U.S. bank. And we had a depression starting in 1837, partly because of banking issues. There were sharp disagreements over the tariff. Industrial interests in the country, particularly New England, supported higher tariffs. That would help their industries fend off especially imports from Britain. They wanted to sell homemade goods to Americans, and there were high tariffs for a while. There was a very serious problem over the tariff in 1832, 1833. South Carolina almost threatened secession over it. They came up with a doctrine called nullification. If you didn't like a federal law, and in South Carolina's case it was the tariff law, you could simply nullify it within your state boundaries. You could claim it was unconstitutional, and there were special procedures for nullification. And if you did that, it wouldn't be law. Whigs tended to inherit the old perspective of Alexander Hamilton that the federal government ought to support internal improvement. They had a broad vision of the national development. One of the leading Whigs was John Quincy Adams, the former president. When he had been president, he had wanted a national observatory and a national university. Democrats were strict constructionists. They believed more in states' rights in most things. And that's why Jackson allowed Georgia really to violate a Supreme Court decision to move their native populations westward in the Trail of Tears as we know it. The point is, things were divided over economic issues. But we were an expanding nation. We've been an expanding nation since our nation's founding. There have been a 20-year hiatus. And then all of a sudden, in the 1840s, and Moses Yale Beach is right in the middle of the swirl of events, something we can't even imagine today. The United States had expanded across almost the whole continent by the 1840s, and it had its eyes on the West Coast. It had its eyes on what we today called the states of Oregon and Washington because we were interested in trade with Asia. Texas had declared its independence with the help of U.S. adventurers back in 1835 and then won it in 1836 in the Texas Revolution. But there had been a process whereby Americans had infiltrated into Texas and then joined the Texas Revolutionary Armies. Texas won its independence with U.S. help. The U.S. government really didn't do a lot to prevent those filibusters from crossing the border illegally. And Texas is an independent republic for about 9 years, and we don't annex it partly because of the slavery problem. Northerners don't want to admit a new slave state to the Union. Texans had rebelled for their independence, partly because the Mexican government had passed all sorts of laws and statutes to prevent future slaves from being brought to Texas. There were slaves there already. The point is that rather than deal with Texas, even though he was a Southerner, Andrew Jackson had been president and he postponed the Texas issue. Eventually, he recognized his Texan independence. But by 1845, Texas, for various reasons, wanted to join the Union. It will be annexed, and this will bring up the slavery issue again. Do you annex Texas with slavery? Mexico is primed for war with the United States, and Mexico owns a large share of the land between the Mississippi River and the Pacific that the United States doesn't own yet. And then Cuba becomes an issue by this time for various reasons. And independently of Texas itself, the state of Yucatan in Mexico is interested in annexation to the United States for various reasons. By the mid-1840s, the French have started thinking about building a canal across Panama that might give them control of trade between the Atlantic and the Pacific, and that could lead to the French dominance of the Gulf of Mexico. All sorts of things are going on, swirling around at once. So Moses Yale Beach and the Sun are in the middle of this, and there are countless columns on the slavery question, on the Isthmus, on Tehuantepec, on Yucatan, on Cuba, on Mexico, on Texas annexation and all that. And in fact, on the Oregon question with Great Britain, because it's coming to a head. The phrase 54-40 or fight, it's one of those things like don't give up the ship. It's one of those key phrases in American history, and that dates from the Oregon controversy. So Beach is in the middle of all this. The slavery question can't be postponed any longer because of all these territorial questions that overwhelm the economic questions that have divided Whigs and Democrats for so long. And of course, the parties don't entirely divide over the slavery question, but Beach is in the middle of this, and right at the time that he gets involved personally in a diplomatic mission during the Mexican War, a representative, a congressman from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot, gets up in Congress and says that President Polk wants the money to continue the war in Mexico. Wilmot proposes that slavery not be allowed in any land we might acquire from Mexico during the Mexican War. Otherwise, Wilmot will prohibit us from getting any land as a result of the U.S.-Mexican War. Moses Yale Beach is going to be in the middle, and his paper will be in the middle of this.
You very, very carefully demonstrate why you are regarded as an expert on these internal logistics of the history of America's westward expansion. So why is a global perspective important, especially as it relates to America's expansion?
You can talk about American expansion very ethnocentrically. You can go back to the fact that our original colonial charters actually gave those modest-sized colonies on the Atlantic coast that Britain had, like Virginia. They got these immense land grants to the Pacific Ocean. Several of them had these kinds of land. You could say expansion was built into America's DNA from the initial founding of the colonies. And then it's easy enough to see that once we became a new nation, our founding fathers inherited these colonial attitudes. John Winthrop said aboard the Arabella, the ship that bore the initial Puritans to New England and their settlement, said we shall be a city on a hill, and all the eyes of the world will be upon us. He had a very, in a sense, ethnocentric view of what they were doing as at the center of the human enterprise. You can look at American history, its development and its expansion in a very ethnocentric lens. You get to the early nation, you realize that our founding fathers thought this way. Jedediah Morse wrote one of our early textbooks, American Geography. Even though we didn't yet own the land across the Mississippi River, he talked about an eventual American empire. By the 1840s, you had Americans talking about manifest destiny. The term manifest destiny, or has been attributed through most historical scholarship to one of Moses Beach's accomplices in the Pony Express and in the setting up of the Associated Press, fellow New York newspaperman John L. O'Sullivan, who not only edited the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, which came out monthly, but he edited Morning News in New York. The News came up with editorials in 1845 having to do with Texas and Oregon that used the term manifest destiny. But there were similar phrases used not only in O'Sullivan's publications, but in earlier statements in other media. The idea of manifest destiny was in the air. More recently, it's been suggested through textual analysis that O'Sullivan's original use of the term manifest destiny was really by his writer, Jane Casno, who went with Moses Beach on his Mexican mission. Jane Casno, who at the time was Jane Storm, wrote editorials for Beach as well as letters to the Sun. So that phrase has been attributed to Jane Storm through textual analysis. That is to say, you analyze her writings under her name, and then you assess was published as Manifest Destiny in O'Sullivan's papers, unattributed columns in which O'Sullivan did not actually sign the columns. The phrase itself meant that God, providence, had destined the United States. It's manifest, it's obvious, and the word providence was inserted into the phrasing that the United States would expand across the entire continent. It was God's will. All those issues can't be understood without a global perspective. You can't understand how we eventually got Oregon without understanding our growing interest in trade with Hawaii, in trade with Asia. The famous Perry expedition to opening up Japan only occurs a few years after Beach's expedition to Mexico during the Mexican War. We've been trading with China since the 1790s. There's a lot of money to be made in that trade, and Britain's interested, especially in the fur pelt trade with Asia and the Pacific, and that's why you have the Hudson Bay Company, which, trapping beaver and so on out in the West, and then you're going to trade with Asia. Whaling trade out of the Pacific. We were interested in Pacific trade, so were the British. We both wanted to control the Oregon Territory. The crisis with Britain that erupted suddenly in 1846 when President James Polk declared the joint occupation with Britain was ending. You can't understand why he would initiate a crisis like this without understanding the broader global stakes involved in Asia. You can't understand why suddenly John Tyler, who was president before James K. Polk, would be interested in Texas without understanding the global implications of what was going on with Great Britain, the African slave trade, Cuba, and Texas. American leaders, but Southern leaders in particular, feared that Great Britain would pressure Spain into abolishing slavery in Cuba. Spain still owned Cuba at this point, and that it would pressure Texas into ending slavery in Texas as the price of staying independent. And Mexico was putting a lot of pressure on Texas. By the mid-1840s, there was the danger that Mexico would try to reconquer Texas. There were rumors and actual reports from U.S. diplomats abroad that Britain was saying to Texas, okay, you want your independence, we'll be the middlemen. We will arrange things so that Mexico will finally formally recognize your independence, free you from the danger of war. You will end slavery in Texas. And similarly, there were fears that Britain intended to end slavery in Cuba. Number one, Cuba is one of the centers of the African slave trade in the whole world, and certainly in the Western Hemisphere. The African slave trade has been illegal internationally for a long time. The U.S. has agreed to treaties against the African slave trade. We've prohibited it by law as of 1808, but they are importing a lot of slaves into Cuba that eventually wind up into Brazil or into the United States illegally, but especially into Cuba. And Cuba's become a great slaveholding society. Some of the slaves are there legally, many of them are imported later, because unlike the United States, which had a slave population that reproduced itself, the slave population in most of Latin America would have died out because of more horrible tropical working conditions, had it not been for infusions of newly chained slaves from Africa onto ships and into Cuba. These new slaves come into Cuba. They're illegal under international law. The Brits are especially anxious, far more anxious than we are, to eradicate slavery in Cuba. Why? Well, for one thing, the U.S. has Southerners dominate the U.S. government. A lot of the presidents are Southerners. They have control, especially of the U.S. Senate court. Southerners, they're very worried when talk comes up about slavery ending in Cuba under British pressure. What might that mean? We had the Nat Turner Rebellion back in 1831. There had been a major slave rebellion plot in Charleston, South Carolina in 1822. There had been a slave plot known as the Gabriel Plot in Virginia in 1800. The worst thing of all for white Southerners in terms of long-term memory, thousands of French whites who died in the Black Revolution in what became Haiti. What's going to happen if you have large numbers of blacks not only free in Cuba, but eventually taking governmental power, perhaps taking up arms? Even if the British just succeed in freeing the legally imported blacks, they may get too much power in Cuba. They may overthrow the slave system. And that might trigger or inspire slaves in the United States to rebel for freedom. Enslaved people in the U.S. know what's going on all over the Caribbean basin. Black sailors arrive, especially on British ships. They're free black sailors, and they bear news when there's a revolt or resistance in the West Indies. There was a black revolt in Cuba in 1844. There's a great fear of Britain intervening in Cuba as well as Texas, and it's spilling over into the United States. One of the authors whom Professor Opelt mentioned has pointed out in her book about runaway slaves to Mexico, Alice Baumgardner, Texas was a real worry, not just that if slavery were abolished there, it might become another free state or anything like that, but just even under Mexican rule and then independence, fugitive slaves could run away to Mexico. And Mexico had abolished slavery. There was a fear if Texas abolished slavery, that would mean fugitive slaves in places like Mississippi could easily escape into freedom by crossing into Texas. But even if Texas stays a slave republic, they can go into Mexico, and they are going into Mexico. So there were all sorts of things going on that meant that the slavery question could no longer be suppressed, and why you have to have a global perspective. The French, as I think I mentioned earlier, have started thinking about a canal across Central America. The United States wants to control the whole Caribbean economically. What happens if you start getting charged tolls to go through a canal? What happens if there are higher tariffs in these areas? Cuba had very high tariffs because Spain controlled it. If the US got control of Cuba, tariffs would go down. There were all sorts of port regulations that interfered with US ships and gave preference to Spanish ships in Cuba. There were all sorts of economic reasons and other reasons, particularly the issue of slavery, that all had to do with global conditions that forced Americans finally to come to terms with Oregon, with Texas, with Mexico, with Cuba, with Central America in the mid-1840s, and help explain the New York Sun, and help to explain Moses Yale Beach.
Let us go back to our historical man on the ground here. You provide us this very, very compelling take on Mexico and on Cuba, and now let's place Moses Yale Beach back there. So you've already shed light for us on his involvement in the Mexican War, and his presence there very much. Now let's take it back to Cuba. Moses Yale Beach played a possibly even more significant role in U.S. attempts to acquire Cuba from Spain. Could you elaborate on this less well-known facet of Beach's very colorful career?
Start with a quote from Beach, an editorial. So the Mexican War is still going on. Are we to give Mexico back to her military despots? We have conquered much of Mexico by this time. Are all passages to the Pacific Ocean to be handed over to England? Is that all-important isthmus to be formed into another mosquito country? This was a protectorate that Great Britain had over part of the British coast. Now, you remember Britain's involved in Cuba also. You put it all together. This shows Beach's linking of all these issues together. The Sun had been one of the leading papers in calling for Texas. That when he goes to Mexico, as a State Department agent, he gets appointed a special agent at $6 a day, plus traveling expenses. Jane Storm's all promoting Texas annexation. She's converted to Catholicism. Both she and he have links to the New York Catholic hierarchy, particularly Bishop John Hughes of New York. What seems to have prompted this trip to Mexico originally, which is going to have a Cuba component, Catholic leaders in Mexico, as well as some conservative Mexican leaders, they're afraid as a result that Mexico, to keep funding going for the war, will start taxing the Mexican Catholic Church property. Various interests in Mexico are interested in making peace. They seem to have gotten word to the United States, to New York, through contacts in Zachary Taylor's army, which was fighting in northern Mexico. This was the U.S. Army that had already conquered much of northern Mexico. They're interested in striking a peace deal over the heads of the Mexican government then in control. President Polk actually writes in his diary that Beach doesn't have permission to strike a peace deal with Mexico. He's not an accredited diplomat. He's just a secret agent. That if he happens to strike a peace deal and he thinks Beach has that kind of thing in mind, he'll certainly take it into consideration. In addition, you've got this wonderful mixing of personal financial gain and U.S. government interests, federal interests. The government is interested in setting up a transit route across the isthmus of Central America and maybe across southern Mexico, where it's very narrow. You could maybe dig a canal. You could maybe just construct a road that would get goods and people across Mexico very quickly to the Pacific, where ships could pick them up and take them to California, which we were in the process of trying to conquer. A railroad maybe. Anything's possible. Beach is sent down with this idea, well, you might get a 6-mile stretch across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Beach had contacts with various commercial interests trying to develop a transit route across Central America that I think he undoubtedly would have profited from if this thing had come to pass. And the government would have subcontracted whatever came out. Beach has an interest in the isthmus. He also comes down with the idea of chartering a national bank of Mexico. Mexico's in debt to foreign powers. The U.S. banking system is stabilized by 1846 when the U.S.-Mexican War starts. Perhaps Beach, with funds provided from his New York banks and New Jersey interests and so on, could set up a national bank of Mexico that would handle all of Mexico's debt, would disperse Mexican funds, and so on and so forth. And of course, Beach would profit from this, as well as the Mexican government. This is part of the deal. And Polk definitely knows that Beach is involved in this kind of stuff when he sends him down there. And they go via Cuba. They meet with a Mexican official who gives them a letter of introduction to Mexico's vice president. They meet with a British diplomat in Cuba, and the British diplomat gives all three of them British passports so that when they go to Mexico, they can pretend to be British citizens. When they land in Cuba, not only does Jane Storm go traveling around the island so that she can write all sorts of travel pieces on her time in Cuba that later get published in the New York Sun. I think she writes something like 16 letters from Cuba that will get published in the months both during and after her trip to Cuba. But the two of them meet with members of a dissatisfied white Cuban bloc of leaders, especially planters, known as the Club de la Habana or Havana Club, who are beginning to think that rather than risk a slave rebellion that might be inspired by the British in the island and all the instability and bloodshed, that they'd be much more stable under U.S. rule. Basically, the United States had a much more stable slave society with much more governmental power to protect slavery. And so there was an interest in annexing Cuba to the United States among many Cuban Creole. Creoles were the second or third generation, not Spanish immigrants to Cuba. They also resented Spanish laws that discriminated against Creoles as opposed to the Peninsulares, the settlers who were born in Spain. A million different reasons. There were Cubans interested in annexation during Moses Yale Beach's time in Cuba, when he and apparently Jane Casno, if we take Beach's editorial we to mean him and Casno, he says he meets with members of this Havana Club at the Aldama estate. Now, Aldama was a Cuban planter. There's some incredible personal ties involved between not only Beach, but John L. O'Sullivan, his cohort in Manifest Destiny. Why is he there? His sister married a Cuban planter named Cristobal Madan, who was a member of the Havana Club in 1846. And he decides to take his honeymoon in January 1846 in Havana, right when Moses Beach is on the scene. They leave Mexico. They leave Mexico separately, and Jane Storm goes back to Cuba, and I think she meets at this time with the U.S. consul, Robert Campbell, and possibly John Thrasher, who was an American who ran an English language paper. It had a Spanish edition in Havana. And in these meetings, what comes out of it is not just that Beach and Storm will support Cuban annexation to the United States and Cuban independence from Spain, of course, as a precursor, but they will also support Cuban media, pro-independence media in the United States, pro-annexation media, and they will support, the Cuban planters will kick in about $30,000 to set up 3 pro-annexation Cuban newspapers in the United States, one of them in New York, which will be under Jane Storm's editorship in the early stages. It will become known as La Verdad, or the Truth, in New York. So they will underwrite her newspaper. There's a huge Cuban revolutionary element in New York that will support this newspaper and eventually help her edit it and eventually take paper over, and she'll become more of a correspondent. This is about, 2/3 of a year or so into the US-Mexican War. The United States has conquered most of northern Mexico. A battle is pending, famous Battle of Buena Vista, which will be the last major battle in northern Mexico on the route to the US conquest of northern Mexico during the war, much of which we will eventually keep. Meanwhile, the Polk administration is planning to conquer the rest of Mexico using Hernando Cortez's original route through central Mexico to Mexico City, the capital. And so following the Spanish conquistadors and going that route into Mexico, in other words, catching Mexico City in kind of a vise with Taylor up north, holding the Mexican forces in place up there. And a new army is going to invade in the south under General Winfield Scott. He'll capture Veracruz and then go inland. In January, after they're doing some Cuba, Storm and Moses Yale Beach and Drusilla show up on the coach. The Mexicans actually are suspicious that they're up to no good. And they take them into temporary, especially Beach, they take into temporary custody as potential spy. They search all their baggage, and then the Mexican officials let them go on to Mexico City, where they will make contact with Mexican clergy. They will make contact with members of the Mexican Congress. Beach himself will eventually claim that it's their prodding that helps lead to a revolt in the capital. There's a military uprising in the capital to overthrow the Mexican government because Santa Anna has been let back into the country stupidly by President Polk. And eventually, Buena Vista, which could have been a disaster for the Americans, wound up being a victory. And what Santa Anna had done was he had, instead of staying in northern Mexico, he had done this incredible march from Buena Vista down to the capital, Mexico City, put his men through hell to get down there to help in the defense of Mexico City. Meanwhile, he couldn't send troops to help on the coast fend off the US attack on the coast. And the reason he couldn't, Beach claimed, was Beach kept 5,000 troops in Mexico City involved because of this uprising he helped finance with the funds he had been supplied. Beach and Storm are both in Mexico City. Beach feels he has to get word to General Scott on the coast, who has put Veracruz under siege, and he sends Jane Storm back to the coast, and she will wind up watching the US attack on Veracruz from a US vessel in the harbor. She'll meet with Scott. Scott doesn't like the idea of being told by a woman about what's going on in Mexico City as Beach's messenger. And he dismisses her as a kind of, he calls her a plenipotentiary, a diplomat in petticoats. The mission goes on with Beach in Mexico City for a short while until Santa Anna's return, and then it becomes obvious that he's running a serious risk of being taken as a spy. So he and Drusilla flee at night. They leave their bags behind. They have a risky venture trying to get to the coast. And rather than go all the way to Veracruz, they go to a more northern port, Tampico, which is under US control already. And then he will go back to the United States, whereas Jane Storm will go on, as I've mentioned, to Cuba. Now, what this mission unleashes is about 9 or 10 years of US diplomacy to annex Cuba that has all sorts of implications. And it might not have happened without Moses Beach and the Sun and Jane Storm, because Beach and O'Sullivan have agreed to, between them, put pressure on Polk to buy Cuba, as does Jane Storm with her columns for the annexation of Cuba that she writes in the Sun and other newspapers. Jane Storm goes and talks to Polk privately after she gets back from Cuba. Beach goes to talk to Polk, so does O'Sullivan. President Polk's under pressure to buy Cuba. He doesn't do so immediately in 1847, but the next year, O'Sullivan goes back with the important Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, and they put pressure on Polk to buy Cuba, and Polk and the Secretary of State Buchanan eventually capitulate, and after cabinet discussions, they agree to make a formal effort to buy Cuba from Spain. Meanwhile, Jane Casno has gotten La Verdad off and running. It's off the press in New York City, and guess whose press publishes La Verdad? It was a dual language newspaper. It had columns in Spanish, columns in English. It was set up primarily to support the incorporation of Cuba into the United States. Moses Beach runs it off the New York Sun's printing presses. And not only that, when they develop a flag for Cuban independence, a flag that will be borne by U.S. and Cuban exile, but mostly U.S. adventurer filibusters who will leave American shores several times over the next few years. There will be actual invasions of Cuba in 1849 and in 1851. Well, the flag they carry is first really raised from the offices of La Verdad and the New York Sun, and the office for La Verdad, it's right across the street from the Sun offices. So this is kind of like sisters in crime. In 1854, the U.S. government, under a different Democratic president, which, remember, the New York Sun, Beach's Sun, is a pro-democratic newspaper, even though it's technically independent of the Democratic Party. A new Democratic Party president will try to buy Cuba, President Franklin Pierce. There'll be a new attempt to invade Cuba that will be put together between 1853 and 1855. The Pierce administration diplomats who were instructed to come up with a plan to get Cuba annexed propose, if Spain won't sell Cuba, then the United States has a right, I would emphasize, to detach it from Spain. In other words, to conquer it for itself. And why would they have that right? Well, there was a real danger that Spain, under British pressure, was going to Africanize the island. This was code, or today we might call it urban slang, for the idea that Britain would finally force Spain to free all black people imported into Cuba in violation of the international statutes against the slave trade, and maybe even emancipate all Cuban slaves. That would set up a tremendous threat. Southern slaves would find out from sailors and other sources. Some of them were literate. Sooner or later, they'd see newspapers with headlines. They would find out that that Cuban slaves had gotten their freedom, and this would inspire them maybe to run away. They could flee by boat to Cuba if they could get their hands on a boat. They could go 90 miles. They might rebel for their independence in the United States. They'd be so inspired by this rich slaveholding island, which produced much of the world's coffee and sugar, suddenly becoming free for blacks. Threat of Africanization, they said, the United States had a right to seize Cuba. And of course, Northern anti-slavery interests are infuriated. And the Pierce administration has to disavow the Ostend Manifesto. It basically takes steps to prevent any filibuster expeditions from reaching. It refuses to deploy U.S. military power against Spain. And the whole effort to purchase Cuba collapses again. For the Civil War, the Buchanan administration will try to buy Cuba. Moses Beach's son, Moses Ferry Beach, took over the New York Sun after Moses Sr. gave up active editorship. He developed a very close relationship with Jane Storm, and there are many letters from Jane Storm to Moses Ferry Beach in the Brewster Beach Family Papers collection. And the New York Sun continued through this period to support Cuban annexation, the Cuban exiles in the United States, and of shrugging off, as Jane Storm did, slavery, the Sun, not one of the United States' anti-slavery newspapers, because if Cuba was going to come into the Union and satisfy Southern demands for new slave states, and there was some talk of making it into 2 slave states, that after the admission of Florida as a state in 1845 and Texas at the end of 1845, there would be no more slave states admitted to the Union, while all sorts of states would be admitted that outlawed slavery, including Oregon. It's very clear that if Cuba was going to come into the Union to appease the South, it would have to come in as one or more slave states. And the Sun is in the middle of this. It's willing to shrug off the slave question in return for keeping the Union together. The Sun will promote this idea, and it will even publish columns by Jane Casno. She's married. In fact, Cuba could be the answer to America's slavery problem. It was a specious argument, but basically what Casno and like-minded people argued was that Cuba could be a great safety valve. When Americans got tired of slavery and wanted to get rid of them, they could shuffle them off to the tropics, first to Texas and then into Mexico and also into Cuba, and it would be a way for America to resolve its slavery problem. And she'd eventually come even to say that the Dominican Republic would be a way to end America's race problem. Storm, Beach are interconnected in Mexico, they're interconnected in Cuba, they're interconnected with both the Mexican and Cuban questions after they get back to the United States, because Beach's newspaper will not only promote the whole idea of 54, 40, or 5, we should annex all Oregon. It will promote the annexation of Texas. It will promote the annexation of all of Mexico. And Jane Storm's columns will first suggest we should get part of Mexico, but she will come around to all Mexico. They're linked intrinsically together to the Mexican War, to U.S. territorial expansion, to Manifest Destiny, to Cuba, which never was annexed, and finally to the slavery question in the United States and in New York City.
And moving through this history, as you so finely detail, is this supernova of intrigue, if I can call it that is Jane Storm. Was the most prolific female journalist on U.S. foreign policy during the antebellum. A woman who rather fearlessly defied the separate spheres ideology of the time that sought to keep women framed within the house or the home, or within the framework of the domestic. We have encountered an 1846 quote attributed to her that reads, "I can do and control over half of the entire circulation of the New York Sun, and from my position thus hold the balance of opinion on any man or measure."
What amazed me the most was her presumptuousness, her effrontery. She wrote an incredible number of letters to not only newspapers. So you see her published in the Baltimore Sun, Philadelphia papers, New York papers. The famous Louisville Courier-Journal editor, Henry Watterson, said that he was an apprentice on the Washington States with Jane Casno. She wrote letters for probably a dozen or so different newspapers over time, maybe more. More than that, she thought nothing, not just of writing opinion pieces for newspapers and expecting to be published, but of writing politicians directly. It's very clear from her letters that she tried to establish a relationship with President Polk. He wrote in his diary that he didn't think he learned much from his 1-hour conversation with her. But nonetheless, he said he listened to her attentively, and She didn't get that far with him, but she had established a relationship and did establish a relationship with James Buchanan, the senator from Pennsylvania, who became U.S. Secretary of State and President. She would think nothing of saying something like, I'm coming around to see you tonight on a given issue, and I'll expect you to receive me at such and such a time, and you can't say no. She had a relationship like that with the Secretary of the Navy, George Bancroft. Under Polk, she wrote letters to William Marcy, the Secretary of War, later U.S. Secretary of State. She wrote large numbers of letters to the famous William Seward, Lincoln Secretary of State, who was a U.S. Senator when many of her letters were written, and who eventually, of course, would be best known for his purchase of Alaska. One of the things about Jane Storm that's fascinating is that she was fascinated with underclasses. And she stuck up for working people in New York. She was very interested in working women in New York. And it wasn't so much that she was pro-union as that she wanted women to compete in skilled trades and get into book publishing and things like that. She was interested in the labor movement in New York. She was very interested in the problem of peonage out in the Southwest. A lot of laborers were impoverished people from what had once been Mexico, people who weren't much better off than enslaved black people in the American South. They were in debt to large white estate owners who employed them to grow crops primarily, but they could also be used in mineral developments and in mining. She wanted a treaty signed between the United States and Mexico outlawing peonage, and she fought for it. And she would write letters to Seward, for instance, who was a Whig. She would say, I'll make this a partisan issue if I have to, and I'll get the Democrats fighting peonage and winning votes with my columns. It's hard to know what to make of this woman, Moses Yale Beach, for all of those of us who study him and grow to find him absolutely fascinating. I don't think he's on the tips of the tongue of most Americans. And I do think most Americans by now have probably heard of Manifest Destiny.
With the AP and this important legacy that it left behind of truthful, of fair, accurate news coverage, it is striking to realize how often, especially in earlier examples of filibustering that you detail, such as during the 1812 war and through the 1837 Patriot uprisings in Canada, there is what we call fake news, playing such prominent parts in battle tactics through false reports to manipulate perceptions. Often such false reportage seemed to be down to the time it took for news to spread. So we can simply call these lies, obviously, and acknowledge that they are part of human history and human nature. But I'm now wondering whether the Telegraph and its innovation for newspapers, especially as Moses Yale Beach saw it, played a part in mitigating such practices and creating, as it were, fairer battlefields, if we could call it that. In your knowledge, do you think news coverage improved as of the 1840s?
That's probably the toughest question you've asked, simply because news was so biased. I just don't know that I could give a firm answer on the press becoming more genuinely objective by the Civil War.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that. On a closing note, to expand really our understanding of American westward expansion. It moves throughout most of your work. You suggest that current history or social study curriculums could benefit from specific correctives to accepted understandings that have been taught for years. Thank you for helping us understand this before the Civil War period in America. It provides us with some insight into our subject of interest, Moses Yale Beach.